We have Gary Sackett from, he's an attorney from Salt Lake, came down from Salt Lake to have this conversation with us. He's with the Gun Violence Prevention Center, and so give him a warm welcome, please. I think we can go ahead and get started while the remainder are getting their pizza. So to both of you, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you being here. And I was telling both of you that I've done dozens and dozens of these events. And yet, trying to curate this event, I think, might have been the most difficult that I've ever done. We had, between the two of us, or the three of us rather, we had hours of conversations, talking about this particular issue. And I think one of the reasons why, because I lecture on this topic all the time, but I think one of the reasons why we have difficulty figuring out how to have a discussion on this is because sometimes it's two ships in the night. On the one side, we'll have people saying, this is a constitutional right, and we need to look to the Constitution. And the other side saying, the United States is different because of the number of gun deaths that we have and school shootings and things like that. And then they'll say, well, yes, we're different because of our Constitution. And round we go. So, Walt, let me start with you, Representative Crooks. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. All right, Walt. You mind if I call you Gary? Just a second. Okay. All right. Great. So, Walt, let's start with that. United States. When you travel around the world, it does seem to be singularly different from a lot of places. We have, the last I saw was 2020, 45,000 gun deaths. That includes suicide and homicide and accidents. But what is it about America that makes us so different in terms of school shootings, in terms of gun deaths, and that sort of thing? What do you think it is?
Well, thank you first for me being here and actually having this conversation. I think this type of group is critical to have these discussions because in order to be able to make any progress on anything, we have to get out of our silos, be able to have some debate in a civil manner, and be able to come up with policies that actually make a difference. So the United States is different, and the Constitution made that difference. And we'll be able to have our freedom, but there is some issues that we have to look at. Like if there's behavior that's causing harm or death to others, that justifies us taking issue and saying, what is really the issue? What really is happening here? And guns are involved in a lot of those issues because we are kind of a gun-centric country. So how do we address this issue and will it really make a difference? So we can look at other countries that do this. We can look at other states that have different policies and procedures with a level of gun control and see if we're getting a measurable output. Because there's a quote that goes and says, judging a policy by its intention is foolish. We should be judging it by its results. And that's legitimacy. So even though that we have something that's a constitutional right, well, what are things that we can adjust to make sure that we are actually protecting individuals, not just the rights?
I really appreciate your approach to that because we're going to talk about a few of the things that Gary's organization has proposed, and I think there's actually some area in which we can have potential agreement about things. But Gary, let me go to you. So what's different about the United States? I suspect you're going to say, well, we just have more guns and we allow more people to purchase guns. But what are your thoughts?
Well, as was just mentioned, we're different because we have a constitution that is different and has been differently interpreted from almost any other advanced nation in the world. How's that? Okay. We can argue that the Constitution, Second Amendment, wasn't ever meant to be the kind of all hands on deck that the Supreme Court has interpreted it to be, but we're stuck with it. So I won't argue that. But we have a country that is culturally, except for the Second Amendment, same or very similar to many other countries in the world, advanced countries. Canada, New Zealand, and Australia come to mind. They're similar. They have similar foundations to them, and yet they don't have the kind of gun violence that we have here by orders of 10 to 20. And so I'm ashamed of the fact that this country can't seem to solve a gun violence problem. There are a number of things we can do, certainly, even with the restrictions that really have been put on us by the U.S. Supreme Court. States have their own discretion to do a great many things that they haven't done, that they won't do. And as a result, what Vince just mentioned, about 45,000 people per year are killed by firearms in this country. And by the way, when you divide it out by the number of hours in a year, by the time this is over, an hour's worth, 4 to 5 people will be dead from guns in this country. And that's just shameful. And the fact that we can't seem to do anything about it is shameful. So there are the things that we can do. None of them by themselves will solve the problem. None of them will reduce gun violence and deaths to zero, but each of them individually will incrementally make a difference, and they're the kinds of things that we ought to be adopting.
Yeah, go ahead, Walt.
All right. I thank you, Gary, for bringing those points up, because there are a lot of gun violence. And so oftentimes when I hear the argument for reducing gun violence is take away the gun, right? That would make sense. Except we have a lot of examples that proven not to be the case. Look at Chicago, for example, and Houston. They're the exact same size primarily. They have the same demographics, the same number of Hispanics and blacks. Yet Chicago's crime rate with guns is enormously high compared to Houston, and Houston has more guns. So how did that happen? And we had a discussion about, well, maybe it's the neighboring states that these guns are coming through. Well, are the neighboring states having that same problem? The answer is no. We have a lot of gun crime to self-inflicted wounds, suicide. So he brought up Australia. I think it's a great point. There's had a terrible gun shooting in 1996, so they had a buyback program and made guns basically illegal. Very, very difficult to get a hold of. So I went back and looked and said, what was the output from it? And I brought this little graph. I don't know if you can see it very well, but this is from starting at 1980, and you can see that there had about 500 deaths or suicides from guns a year, and after 1996, it dropped to 100. Now that's pretty remarkable, right? Now there's no borders, right? No one's swimming guns across the ocean to get to these guys, so it dropped 80%. That is very remarkable and should take our attention. But the part that we're not hitting on is this other aspect. The blue line above it shows non-firearm related suicides is around 1,500, and after 1996 it went to 2,500. So we saved 400 lives from a gun, but it went up 1,500 from non-firearm items. And this is the hard part about this discussion. I think that's why most people come to these. They come with an opinion and they leave with the same opinion, because it's much more difficult to try to find a solution than just taking away guns. Honestly, removing guns is the laziest way to fix this problem, because it's not to do about guns. And we have evidence after evidence that shows that the case. Is it poverty? Is it the way that you were raised, where you were raised? Why is that? Even in Chicago, you can get a little granular and find out it's a very, very small part of Chicago that has these gun crimes. And then they say, let's take away the AR-15s, right? Because that's what you kill a lot of people with. Except it's only 2.8% of the gun violence is from AR-15s. Most is from pistols. This week we had a school shooting in Russia, right? A little different than us, but they still have extremely tight gun control. A very, very fascist system when it comes to gun control. And someone went in and killed 13 kids and 21 others were wounded. What did he use? Now, Think of the Russian version of the AR-15. It's an AK-47, right? He used 2 pistols with 10 round magazines and killed all those people and wounded all the others. So what really is the situation? So I went through when I passed, and you may not know this, but you can now concealed carry in Utah without a permit, and 26 other states do it. So we went back 30 years of data and saying, what was the change when someone went from the having strict rules on gun control to none? Did they see an increase in crime? And this is not really a left or right issue. Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Montana, Washington State, New Mexico, those are all Democrat states, and they have the same policy. And again, no increase. I have one, if you don't mind, one piece of data I want to read from it. I thought
Sure, and we'll come back to HB 60.
yeah, Gary, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take this time away from you, but this is, when we started going through this, I looked for the most unbiased data that I could find, because if you look at anybody that doesn't like guns, they have all the data in the world that shows how terrible guns are. If you look on the guys who love guns, they have all the data in the world that shows how great guns are, and they stop war crimes and they cause all. So where's the truth? So FBI crime statistics is a pretty good place to start. But I found one, and here's a whole list of studies that I went through and found. Dr. Lott was one that did a lot of them. But this came from the Journal of the American College of Surgeons. So I'm like, well, who's the author? And he was a brain surgeon that got sick and tired of patching up bullet holes. He's in New York and said, this is ridiculous. We got to figure out a way to get our legislature to hear policies that cause problems. And he's patching up deaths, or trying to patch up deaths, and the ones that get shot. And this is his conclusion. This is in the, I'll look this up, and I hope that you do so. This is about permitless carry. We investigated whether liberalization of the state concealed carry legislation was associated with a change of rates of homicides or other violent crimes. The studies demonstrated no statistical significance associated between liberalization of state level firearm legislation, policy efforts aimed at injury prevention, and the reduction of firearm related violence should likely investigate other targets for preventive intervention. They're saying the same thing that what I've concluded is we have other issues here, and hopefully we can go with that, but I'll pause so Gary has some.
Yeah, no, Gary, you get a good amount of time if you want to sort of rebut what Walt was saying. But the way I hear it, I'm hearing people who are in favor of more gun control and gun restrictions, you always use a comparative analysis to other countries. And I think what Walt's saying is, well, you can actually do a comparative analysis within the country. So what are your thoughts about that, comparing various areas of the country? And then maybe we can get into permitless carry and concealed carry and that sort of thing a little bit later.
I'm not sure why we should ignore what happens in other countries. The fact is that the likelihood of you being killed by firearm in Canada, for example, is a tenth of what it is in this country. It's a 25th of what it is in the UK, for example. So, am I advocating that we go around and round up all the guns? Well, it's too late for that, frankly. The Australians and the New Zealanders did figure it out, but it figured it out fairly early, where it was a tractable problem. Here, that nobody's suggesting, at least nobody on my side of the fence, is suggesting that we go door to door and pick up your guns. However, we would see major reduction in violence if we eliminated the access to military-style weapons. There isn't a single reason that, other than for national defense and law enforcement, for an individual to have a weapon of the type that the AR-15 and the AK-47s are weapons with 12, 15, and 20 bullet magazines. The fact is, there is an area where we can do some good if we reinstate the law that existed for 10 years in this country that made it illegal to buy, possess, manufacture military weapons for civilian use. It lapsed in 1990, I believe, but it was effective at the time, and we could do that again. Frankly, there's no reason for me or anybody who is not in the military or not in law enforcement to have those kinds of weapons. Another place where we could do some good. Think about how many of the mass shootings that we have heard about recently were done by someone who was not yet 21. Why in the world do we allow people who are not, and by the way, most of them are male, almost entirely male. It's pretty well established that we males don't really mature mentally and emotionally till about 25. I'm one of them. And so we have one opportunity to do the same thing we do with alcohol. We don't let people buy alcohol until they're 21. Why do we correspondingly allow people who are 19 and 18 to get online or go to your local store and buy something that is a machine of mass destruction? It's a simple fix. Will it solve all the problems? Absolutely not. Will it solve some of the problems? Yes. Walt just cited that some part of what takes place with guns is a small percentage. So does that mean we ignore it? It's just a small percentage. We'll put up with it. No, I don't think we should put up with it.
Yeah, and Walt, the points I'm hearing do relate to school shootings. The two things he was talking about with respect to age and with respect to military style weapons. And so I thought maybe you could address that, because by my calculations, the United States has more school shootings by roughly a factor of 40 than the next closest country. So maybe you can address the age question and the military style weapons question.
The age issue is actually a really good point that we've been able to discover. So how do we fix that problem? One is, when are you adult? Are you 18 or are you 21? And figure out what that is. If you're 18, we'll send people to the military and they can go shoot whatever they want there, and they're fine with a gun. But when they come back, they can't now have a gun, right? So are you an adult when you're 18 or are you adult when you're 21? So we looked at that data, and guess what we found out? And it's a state issue that controls this. When you're a juvenile and you do something stupid, when you're 18, you kind of get a fresh start, right? Because kids are kids, and now you're starting to be responsible. The one point I want to get to this, I'm going to come back to this, personal responsibility and accountability. So what about these kids? And in the last school shooting was the same situation. A kid that was 18 went and purchased the gun, and there was no background check past 18. Well, guess what? You can't do that in Utah. Utah looks at your background checks. DCI is the Bureau of Criminal Investigations out of Salt Lake City. When you buy a gun, you get a background check. And they go back 7 years. Most states only go to 18 and stop. So you could have been a kid with some serious issues, and when you're 18, that doesn't come up. But you can't buy a gun in Utah if you're 19 or 21, if when you were 17, if you had a violent crime.
So wait, let me stop you here, because I think we might get some agreement. Because one of the things Gun Violence Prevention Center has on their website is expanded or significant background checks being performed. And it sounds like Walt's in agreement with you there, Gary. Anything you hear in there that you object to? Or?
Well, I didn't hear him say exactly that we should institute universal background checks. The fact is that there is a whole population of transactions that take place that are not subject to background checks. You can buy guns online, off the internet, without a background check.
That's not true, by the way, Gary. But you're right about
if you
there
don't
are
mind,
loopholes, right? Private individuals.
If you don't mind,
Sure.
there are online purchases. The number of purchases that are at gun shows from unlicensed dealers is legendary. If you want to buy a firearm, and you don't think you can pass a background check, go to a gun show, track down an unlicensed dealer, and you're in business. So perhaps we could agree if we simply extend the existing background checks to catch everybody. Everybody should be subjected to a background check if they're going to buy a firearm or trade a firearm. And so that would be consistent with about 90% of the people in this country. There are recent polls to show that there is remarkable agreement among Republicans and Democrats even about this issue. And why can't we get it done at the state or federal level? I have no idea. Well, I do have an idea. The gun lobby has been so successful. The gun lobby should be the standard for people who want to accomplish something. They have been so successful in persuading legislators, both local legislators and federal legislators, that more guns are good for the country. That's partly why we have the problem we have. Here we have an issue, by the way, where there's almost uniform agreement that we should do something about it. Expand background checks to catch everybody, and yet we can't seem to do it.
Well, there's going to be a number of students here that have taken my American government class, and they'll know when we get to interest groups, I use the NRA, 5 million members, and they get what they want despite, and he's correct, 90% in some polls for universal background checks and 80% for other provisions. And so you're not saying universal background checks.
I am absolutely not saying universal background checks. And we say powerful lobbies like the NRA. So why is the NRA powerful? Because a lot of people want them to go support their desires. It's democracy at its finest. You put your money where your mouth is. That's why the NRA is powerful. Because I am an NRA member, and I put my membership because it's important to me. But these background checks, let's talk about them. So I believe in smaller government. I think people are smart and creative. Government doesn't create wealth. Government doesn't create these things. It's individuals. Innovation does not come from government. It comes from people. So the smaller government, the better, until we see something that actually makes a difference. So let's look back at these gun shootings, especially for schools, or just homicides in general. Are these weapons being purchased illegally, or without a background check? Are they bought from a private seller? The answer is no. If you look at every single one of them, had been bought from a dealer, from an FFL, which is the Federal Firearms License Dealer, that had to get a background check. So the part that we do agree, Gary, is that when someone buys a weapon and we go through the background check, is where does that stop? So I believe that someone is created, it's called a restricted person. Did you know you can't, even though we don't have a concealed carry law in Utah that you have to get a permit, if you've been drinking, if you had any violence issued to your girlfriend or your brother or whoever else, if you're on drugs, you are a prohibited person. If you committed a felony, you're a prohibited person. You can't carry a weapon. So that's what we need to get to is, where is the personal accountability of people? And we're not addressing those issues.
And is that what you would say in response to Gary's point about military-style weapons?
Again, I would go back to the data. So we're talking about, well, let's take everybody's ability away because we're going to save 2.8% of the problem. I said, well, where's the real problem? Is there another solution that's encompasses the 2.8% as well? And I think there is. If you look back, like when I went to high school, you guys weren't even born yet, maybe a few of you, but none was here. I had a gun in my truck. Most of the kids in my school had a gun in their truck. We didn't have school shootings, and we didn't have the significant suicide rate. Why? What is different? We had, and you say, well, there's more guns, but in St. George, there was only 8,000 people. And I think I had 4,000 guns in my house. I'm exaggerating, of course. There's a lot of guns around, all right? So why was there not any gun violence?
Let Gary address himself to that. So what do you think of that point, which is the idea that when we were kids, there wasn't as much gun violence. There weren't words like Columbine, Parkland, Uvalde in our language. They hadn't found their way in because Columbine hadn't happened, frankly, yet. What's the response to that, Gary?
I'll confess that the culture has changed, but the availability of military-style weapons has made it possible for someone to do the kinds of unspeakable things that didn't occur when Walt was a kid. He carried a gun in his pickup, perhaps, probably a 22, unlikely an AR-15, unlikely a Glock. One of the things that has changed over that time is the availability of very dangerous weapons and the multiplicity of them. The number of guns in this country, as measured today, which is around 400 million, makes what existed in Walt's high school days a pittance. It simply did not exist. And so I would agree that we do need to do as much as we can about instilling personal responsibility. But part of personal responsibility is to support those kinds of things that will make it easier for us to control kinds of violence that take place with firearms. And if making the age 21 to buy a firearm is going to do that, it would certainly have prevented a number of the recent mass shootings. The one in Uvalde, Texas is an example. He may have bought it legally, but he was not 21, he was 18 or 19. So there's an easy place to make some progress. Will it solve everything? No, but it's a way to peck away at the issue.
And what about that? So if we were to raise the age, and let's just require a permit, for example. I know that you sponsored HB 60, and but we require people to have a license to drive, right? This is the argument that you very often hear. Why wouldn't we require them to have gun safety training and a license and a certain age, and maybe we could raise that age and get rid of some of these shootings that occurred from 18-year-olds who bought it legally from guns. So what about that? Why not a permit? Why not compare this to driving, for example?
Well, there's a couple of reasons that I would say that's silly. For one, it's not a constitutional right to drive a car. However, if the permitting process actually worked, then that's a conversation to have. And we have 30 years of data and 26 states that show that it doesn't. So I want to hit the point because, we talk about the 2.8%, and that doesn't sound like a lot unless it's your 2.8%. If it's your child, if it's your neighbor, your buddy. We have the same issue with drunk driving, right? We're not getting rid of cars. We're not getting rid of alcohol. But if your friend died in a drunk driving accident, you're ticked. Or COVID. We know someone who died from COVID, and then we're going to make everybody, stay in their homes for years on end because someone died from COVID that you know. That's the issue is what is causing the problem? Where is the breakdown? And I believe that we're being kind of lazy. We're just going, hey, use the guns, so stop guns. Hey, can't use rocks. Let's get rid of rocks. Whatever. That doesn't work. So where is the issue? And I've seen a significant change in social behavior since the 90s. And Facebook is one of them. Facebook, social media, because you get people are isolated. There's another thing that came along with that, and I call it the trophy kids. Everybody had to have a trophy when they're growing up. No one could lose, right? But when you start getting picked on and bullied, believe it or not, people were bullied before 1990, okay? Have you ever had your head in a toilet? I've seen it. I don't think toilets are very comfortable when you get your head shoved in there, or push a penny down the river, or have your jersey ripped off. That happened to me when I was a sophomore because I was a senior, could wear your jersey on senior day. But there was some bullies that it hurt. And nowadays we have bullies, but people feel victimized. There's nothing else. They're siloed. What do you hear from every person that commits a crime? He's a loner, kept to himself, kind of picked on. We're having a breakdown of the family. We're having the breakdown of the community. And we're substituting it with this virtual friends. So people feel like it. So when I was picked on by that senior that tried to rip off my jersey, I had my buddies who we went out and hung out. There's this mental thing that recoups. But is social media bad now when you get rid of it? No. But we have to realize that we are still accountable. The thing that irritates me more than anything is when someone committed a heinous crime and said, I had no choice. I was having a mental health issue. I was breaking down. I'm like, bull crap. You're responsible for your own freaking actions, no matter if you hurt someone else if you're picked on or not. And that's what we're losing in society. We're losing the personal accountability, the personal responsibility of your behavior. And I think a direct root of that is the breakdown of society about where do we actually coalesce together, whether it's a fraternity or whether it's your church group or whether it's scouts or whether it's your family or your friends.
I have a feeling Gary's going to have something to say about that.
Let me at least address the difference between licensing a driver and licensing a gun owner. The lame excuse about why they're different is that there is no constitutional right to drive a car, but that's simply not relevant here. We do license, we are permitted to license gun owners. The Constitution does not say thou shalt not license a gun owner under certain circumstances.
And that's true, right? The Supreme Court has allowed for a lot of different kinds of restrictions, even though they struck down one in New York recently.
So saying that that's the difference between licensing a driver and licensing a gun owner, it simply doesn't apply. We should be licensing gun owners, at least young ones who have yet to reach some kind of mental maturity. So beyond that, and all of that discussion about Facebook and that sort of thing is irrelevant here. We have to deal with it. We can't solve it, and we shouldn't let it distract us from the real problem about gun violence. We have the ability to do something about gun violence, and ranting about what social media is doing to our youth is really not relevant. I mean, I might agree with Walt about it. I'm older, frankly, to remember the good old days when it didn't exist. We think it was better then, but it doesn't really matter. It's with us now, and it's something we have to deal with. And saying we need to take personal responsibility is good. It's motherhood. It's apple pie, but it doesn't directly get to the problem that we have.
And well, I mean, when you do a comparative analysis, you have to admit, I mean, they have social media in other countries. They have violent movies in other countries. The difference seems to be what Gary's saying. We have 400 million guns. And then we're going to go to the audience.
Okay, yeah, I think that's the case, but what they don't have is the freedom to and the victimization that we celebrate here. That, we talk about it's not relevant. Yes, it is relevant. That's like saying, well, guns aren't relevant because they're here to stay. Everything's relevant, but what really is the issue? Are we going to try to attack something and come out with a result that doesn't accomplish our purpose? Or are we really going to take the hard work? Because it's hard. I mean, trying to address poverty, single mothers, trying to address mental breakdown, mental health. I mean, the state's put a lot of money into mental health into schools. How do we harden our schools? There's a lot of issues that are going forward to reduce it. And guess what? We are seeing the first year, this year, and guess where the money came from? My permitless carry bill. There's people that are getting permits that putting up the money to go to help suicide the first year that suicides dropped in Utah. The first year. So, what's that?
So I think that Gary might become apoplectic if he hears that the money to go against gun violence is coming from the permits from
gun owners.
Gun owners. Gary, what about the issue, before I go to the audience, what about the issue of self-defense? Because that's what you hear from the pro-gun side quite often is that the statistics vary widely, so let's stay away from them. But that people, and including women, are able to use handguns to defend themselves in this country. What do you say to that? And then I'll go to you all.
Well, you can't stay away from the statistics. The statistics will tell you that you are more likely to end up a victim of a shooting than not if you are carrying a firearm. And let me say something about the ability of people to defend themselves. Somehow there's this myth that if you're carrying a firearm, you'll be able to simply take care of anyone who comes after you, anyone who tries to assault you. There was a time when I had a conversation with a an ex-FBI agent. And he said, the hardest thing for us to do as law enforcement officers is to learn how to and to be prepared for how to deal with someone else with a firearm. He says it's frightening and it's something we simply don't ever look forward to, and we don't know how to do it right many of the times, and we can't imagine that the average citizen who's carrying a firearm in his holster or in a handbag is prepared to do that kind of thing, to make that decision about, do I shoot someone or not? So the
Yeah.
statistics
Yeah.
do matter.
No, what I meant is in terms of the number of people who actually defend themselves. He's right that it's pretty clear that if you have a firearm, that you're far less likely to defend yourself with that firearm than you are to be harmed by it.
I've seen those statistics.
Yeah, but I guess what I want to ask is, when we're bringing up self-defense, because I know this is an argument that your side makes quite often, aren't we really talking about a culture where you wouldn't need to defend yourself if there weren't so many guns and other people that had guns as well?
Well, I think the evidence in Australia showed that without moving all the guns, that crime still went up, deaths still went up, and they call it non-firearm related deaths. You can go look it up. You should, so you know for yourself. But that's my issue. Is like, are we doing something that actually solves the problem? Is removing guns solve the problem? And I can tell you, because I've done the hard work and I've gone through. It took me 4 years to gather all this data, that it does not make a difference. It doesn't make a difference. And you can look at FBI crime statistics and it shows that very thing.
Okay.
So I encourage you, go out and look. Like this happened this week. A 97-year-old lady, a guy broke into her house and she used her husband's .44 and shot him. And I'm like, she stopped him from hurting him. He had killed someone else down the road. I'm like, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows both ways. So I'd like to stay away from statistics because you can make them say whatever you want, but raw numbers are pretty clear.
Yeah. Okay, great. We're going to go to the audience. So raise your hand if you have a question, and Hannah will come to you.
This is for your point earlier. So in the event of the problem,
Whose
reason,
point? For Representative Brooks?
Yes, yours. Thank you. Is the culture, is the breakdown of the family. How do we change this culture quick enough to prevent further unnecessary deaths, such as what happened in Texas, without stifling or sacrificing closely held values in this country, such as free speech?
So there's a couple issues there, and I think one of them is Utah put over $100 million into our K through 12 schools because of school shootings. And how many shootings do you see in airport? None, right? There's like no shootings in airport because it's very tightly controlled. You have one entrance and many exits. And that's what we need to start doing and implementing in Utah, where we have a hardened entrance and many exits to get out. That is the number one thing. And any that's insecurity or protection, that's the number one thing. We've had tons of reports, tons of experts come to the state saying, where can we put your money, because it's your tax dollar money, to the best effort? Get rid of guns? Well, we show it doesn't really work in other states, but hardening a school does. And so I think that's the key point, is how do we save lives? And where do we put resources to that effort to make it work the best outcome?
Gary, did you want to address that?
Do we really want to turn our society, our culture, into one in which schools are hardened, where there are magnetometers at every entrance and standby guards? Somehow, that's not the kind of country I want to live in. And I'm appalled at the suggestion that we can solve our gun violence problem with kids by just locking down the schools and making sure that nobody has a toy pistol. It's just unthinkable that that's the answer to our problems.
Except it works.
Okay, here's another question.
I'm wondering if Representative Brooks has been in a mass shooting, or anyone he knows or loves has been in a mass shooting.
I have not, and I appreciate that question because that is a driver, and I kind of led to that with DUI or some loss of COVID. It is a very, very emotionally charged subject. And it can make us look beyond the reality of the output of the function, the real data that comes from it. And so that's kind of a warning. You have to step back. But I have not had anybody die from a gunshot. I have had a very close person die from COVID, and it makes me sensitive. But I still have to step back and say, what are we going to do that's actually effective?
Well, it's not effective. I was in a mass shooting 15 years ago, and it was an anomaly then, and it's daily, 2, 3, 4 a day now. So what's happened in those 15 years?
That's my point exactly. What is happening in that 15 years? What is happening?
Okay.
I read a Time article which presented both the right for guns, keeping guns, and those against, for more control. It was written about 2018, and I believe that we are still pretty much along the lines of what that article pointed out, which was 90% of America agreed that we should have national background checks, number one. Number two, 80% of the people polled believed that we should not have assault weapons. And I am wondering why the politicians have not changed the laws in all these years.
Well,
I would think Sandy
Sandy Hook.
Hook would have been a start, and we haven't changed.
I think, Gary, I think you kind of addressed this, and Walt touched on it slightly, but it was the effectiveness of the NRA that we know. I mean, it's a small group, relatively small, but talk about grassroots mobilization and giving money and that sort of thing is quite an effective group. I think they sort of addressed that, but it's still a good question, and I think that's why.
I want to hit one point because it's me, because I'm a legislator and I'm a representative of people. My people that I don't represent people from Salt Lake. I don't represent people from Park City or New York. I represent people from St. George up to Enterprise. They don't want me voting for that type of law. And the data just shows that it is not a benefit to them or to society in general. I do think that we have to do something. I do. But just because we saw a gun, say, we're going to get rid of that gun, is lazy. And it is not putting in the work to find out where it's at. Background checks. We do that in Utah. We do that in Utah.
They go across state lines.
So let's look at the school shootings. Did they go across state lines? The answer is no. Did they get their guns legal by a background check? Yes.
Okay.
How do you stop that school shooting because he got his gun with a legal background check?
Gary, did you want to address that? Or I think we sort of have with the effectiveness of the NRA, and then what Walt's saying is well, my constituents don't want it.
Well, I doubt that, I would ask this just rhetorically. Do all the citizens in Washington County really not want universal background checks? That's the claim he just made. I'm having a hard time believing it when even in Utah, throughout Utah, and there aren't enough liberals in Salt Lake to weight this on the other side, Utahns uniformly are for uniform national background checks. And why there is the resistance to it, I just can't imagine.
Yeah, there does seem to be that disconnect. All right, let's get some students in here.
So I just kind of wanted to state that, like, if you look into American history, even when we put like the 18th Amendment out, like banning alcohol, people still got that alcohol in illegal ways. If people want to do something, they're going to do it, even if it's illegal or not. So I think it's just a matter of like, what else are we going to do to try and help the people like stop the gun violence? Not about what they're doing with, like what they're using for the violence, but what's making them cause that violence. You know, like we need to look into how we can help these people stop being violent.
Let's go to Gary on this one because he and I have discussed this.
Well, it is to me a myth to say if you make it illegal, the bad guys will get guns anyway. Well, yes, some of them will. And once again, it's incremental. If you make things hard to get, illegal, and this is something that is easily established, it will reduce the amount of crime. It will reduce the availability. So to throw up your hands and say, if you make it illegal, somebody will just be able to go around the law. That's simply not true. So are there ways for us to get at the problem? We've not talked about these emergency protective orders that have been adopted by a number of states, which are designed to identify problem areas, problems with people who show violent intent and are brought before a judge by a relative, by law enforcement, by a domestic partner to get at and prevent possible domestic violence. It's something that was before the Utah legislature a couple of times and died both times. I'd like to see it again. Don't know what Representative Brooks thinks about this, but there's another area where there's work to be done and can be done. 19 states have adopted so-called ERPOs, these red flag laws, and with considerable effect. Does it solve every problem? No, not at all. Is it a problem of a violation of due process? No, they're not due process violations. They are constructed to give appropriate due process, and they have been shown to have some effect, some effectiveness in identifying people who are momentarily often inclined to violence against a domestic partner or a family member.
Yeah, well, 3-day waiting periods, red flag laws, those kinds of things. Why not? I mean, that's pretty much what his organization is advocating for. Incremental steps and doing something, why not a little bit? Why not these incremental steps?
Well, because the waiting period I thought was an interesting concept. So we looked at states that did that. And guess what happened? After 3 days, the crime was still being committed. There's an issue. I think there's some emotional reactions that people want to have a little delay period. So intuitive, that seems that would be correct. So I haven't seen it actually bear out, anything that it bears out. So you brought up a great point. I appreciate you bringing that because illegal drugs are illegal. Now, I would love to ask a question if I may. Goodbye. Is students, raise your hand if you know someone that you could go get drugs from. Oh my gosh, they're here and they're illegal. This is the problem. There's a root to this problem, and I love Gary. Gary, I think it's great for him to come down. His organization, that the gun violence prevention, I had some issues with it, so I went and looked it up, and I thought it was interesting. If you want to stop crime, it says 5 things you can do today. Number 1, watch this video. Number 2, give us money, contribute to DFC. Number 3, social media, like some social media. 4, contact us if you want an educational event. And 5, contact your state rep. Well, I think it's backwards. The first thing you should do is you have the right to go to your representative and say, stop this. This is my feelings. This is what I want, whether it's data or not. But when one of your first things to say, give us money, I kind of start saying, maybe this entity, now because the NRA has the same thing, right?
Yeah, and so do politicians. Well, they're always asking me for money.
I never have asked for a dime.
Oh, okay.
I never have. I said I do this because I don't want to be a politician. You call me a politician, it's a kind of offensive term to me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So yeah, punch you in the nose next time. Right. So anyway, but I have never asked for a dime, and I think that organizations have to function. So I'm not going to criticize him for being part of this, trying to get the funds necessary to move their entity together. But really, that's the first things you can do today. No, the first things you can do today is get your voice known. Write a letter, make a phone call, call Mike Lee, call Stewart, call.
But they also have a whole list of things that are relatively.
Those are the top 5 things I read.
I know, but they have a list of about 20 things that are pretty non-controversial in terms of public opinion. Maybe not here in Washington County, but throughout the thing. So let's move aside from that. See if we can get another question.
All right, Mr. Brooks, I got 2 questions for you. And the first one's, you seem to be pretty proud of the fact that we don't need a permit to carry here in Utah. I'm just curious on why you believe that's a win, because to me, it kind of just seems like it's more guns in circulation, easier to get, which would result in more violence. And also, you say that the statistics show that crimes are still had in states that have like the flag laws. But I think that's like more an extreme status. Like, for example, a school shooting. Like, if we get a mentally ill kid that comes in there, you have 3 days to check his background. He may not commit that crime. So, like something like that. That may not stop everyday things, but so I'm
Okay.
just curious on how you
Well,
feel about that.
your second question, I think the most valid, and I think that this is where Gary and I actually agree on, is we do background checks for what reason? Is to see if there's any criminal intent or violent behavior, right? And it shouldn't end when you're 18. And most states, unfortunately, they're usually liberal states, they end there. Utah's not one of them. We check back 7 years. So if you're 18, it goes back till you're 11 if you've been in juvenile detention or had any other crime. I think that's an effective piece because the whole purpose of a background check is to check your background, right? First one, you said why I'm proud of the concealed carry. For one, I am a staunch believer from the very beginning of our founding of our country that a smaller government provides a better environment for us to succeed and have prosperity. And we proved that over and over again. So we started encroaching on this area and said, well, we're going to make these limitations difficult for, or a little more, another step. I mean, difficult is not the right word, but another step or a barrier for you to be able to carry your gun. Because I can open carry in Utah. Not one person complains about that. But if I cover it with my jacket, now I'm breaking the law. To me, that is ridiculous. Does that show? Is it showing that it's significant or showing any benefit? And the situation is no. So I am in legislation really for one reason, to get government out of our lives that's not providing the result that we want.
What do you think, Gary?
To say that nobody would complain about open carrying or concealed carrying is simply not true. People who see folks carrying sidearms as open carry and because they can, they may not say anything, but they leave. It's frightening, frankly, to see somebody carrying a sidearm, and it's legal by the way for you to go to your gun show or gun shop, buy an AR-15, sling it over your back, and stroll down the street. Does everybody think that's justified? No. People will move out of the way. People leave stores where that happens. So it's simply not true to suggest that it's okay and everybody's fine with it. People are not fine.
I probably have to clarify. You're absolutely correct, Gary. I think people have issues with it. What I'm talking about is anybody presenting any legislation from the anti-gun groups to get rid of open carry? And there's not. That's what I meant. Sorry.
Okay, another question, please. Yeah. No worries.
All right. So I was just wondering, on top of the background checks, why not do mental health evaluations and assessments? Because they could not be violent on like 7 years before, and they're going into buying a gun like for violence, but like no one knows, and it could be a new mental health condition that just came up. And if we evaluate that and understand like if they're not like right, like and they need help, then we can give them the help and we don't make a bad decision by selling them.
That sort of goes to both of you, I believe, because in a sense you could say that's a question about expanding background checks, but in another sense I think she's pointing to something else that's occurring. Gary, do you want to address that first?
I'm a little unclear about what you're suggesting we do.
So just like assessing like everyone's mental health before they get a gun. So like we understand like where they are mentally and make sure that they're like mentally stable and healthy.
Theoretically, I think it's a great idea. As a practical matter, it just is not possible, I'm afraid. The best we can do, it seems to me, are things like the red flag laws, where there is some sign of violence or intent to commit violence, but to subject someone to a beforehand mental test, I don't think is a practical thing that we could justify.
And well, I'll let you finish. I know you got to get out of here. So
Yeah,
we're
That's really the crux of this whole issue, right? Because people usually go commit crime because they have a mental issue. Normal people don't do that. So how do we identify that issue? And that is, I think Gary nailed it right on the head. That's nearly impossible because who's the person that's making that justification? We see this right now, this fight on Twitter. Your language is hateful and hurtful and dangerous. So who's deciding if you're mentally ill or not? That's the hard part. If we had a system that we could actually see if someone was suffering with mental illness, I think we'd solve that problem, all of it, right? So that's a good idea. Just figure out how to do it. I have no idea.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to have to conclude it. Representative Brooks has to get out of here, and we're running a little over time anyway. So thank you all for coming out today. We could have talked for this for hours and hours and hours, as we did in advance. So will you give them a round of applause for coming out here? Thank you. Our next event is next Thursday at noon. The governor's coming down and is going to be speaking with the president of the university in the Gardner Ballroom next Thursday at noon.